All right, let's go. Number 10, the U-2. In 1955, the Central Intelligence Agency began flight testing a single-engine reconnaissance aircraft at a dry lakebed in southern Nevada called Groom Lake. The aircraft was the U-2, designed by Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson under a program the agency would not formally acknowledge in writing for nearly 6 decades. Civilian radar operators and airline pilots had never tracked anything built like it, and the Federal Aviation Administration itself was not read into the program's true purpose, leaving the very agency responsible for explaining unusual air traffic with no explanation to give. The U-2 cruised above 60,000 feet, more than 10,000 feet higher than any commercial airliner flying at the time, and nearly twice the operating ceiling of most military interceptors sent up to identify it. From the ground at dusk, its polished airframe caught sunlight the observer below could no longer see, throwing back a burning, elongated glow that could last for several minutes after the sun itself had dropped below the horizon. But here is where the U-2 becomes the single largest driver of unidentified flying object reports in American history. According to a CIA internal history declassified in 1997, the U-2 and its successor aircraft accounted for more than half of all UFO reports filed with the United States Air Force between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s. Pilots were instructed to deny anything unusual if questioned by air traffic control. Air Force officers assigned to Project Blue Book, the service's own UFO investigation unit, were, in a number of documented cases, never told what they were actually chasing, and were left to close cases as unexplained, rather than reveal a program with a higher classification than their own. The cover held for decades. The reports did not stop until the public, without knowing it, had already been watching the aircraft the whole time. The CIA's own historians would later write that the U-2 explained the majority of sightings reported during the peak years of American UFO panic, a statement made not by a conspiracy researcher, but by the agency responsible for the aircraft itself, in a document it had classified for over 40 years before releasing. Number 9. OXCART. By 1957, the U-2's altitude advantage was already eroding as Soviet interceptors and surface-to-air missiles improved, and the CIA authorized a follow-on aircraft under a program named OXCART. The result, first flown at Groom Lake in April 1962, was the A-12, a titanium airframe built almost entirely from metal sourced in part through third-party purchases from the Soviet Union itself, since the United States lacked sufficient domestic titanium supplies for a design meant to outrun Soviet radar. The A-12 cruised at Mach 3.2, fast enough to outrun most surface-to-air missiles of the era before they could complete an intercept, and it radiated heat so intense that its titanium skin glowed a dull orange in flight, expanding several inches in length as it accelerated. Its shape, viewed from below at altitude, bore almost no resemblance to any aircraft the public had ever been shown in an air show or a manual, and its cockpit instruments were calibrated for conditions closer to the edge of space than to conventional high-altitude flight. But here is where OXCART becomes something closer to a manufactured mystery than an accidental one. Declassified CIA planning documents show agency officials anticipated the sightings and discussed in writing how to manage the eventual reports before the aircraft ever flew a single operational mission. The cover story assigned to the program was not silence, it was misdirection, engineered in advance for a shape the public was never supposed to correctly identify, let alone connect to a government project. Internal memoranda of the period, later released through historical FOIA requests, show officials debating which cover explanations would be most plausible to civilian air traffic controllers, months before a single A-12 had left the runway at Groom Lake. Number 8. The SR-71 Blackbird. The Air Force variant of the OXCART airframe, designated the SR-71, entered service in 1966 and would fly reconnaissance missions for more than 2 decades, based in part out of Beale Air Force Base in California, but tested, refined, and upgraded at Groom Lake for the entirety of its operational life, with modifications made in complete secrecy between deployments that the aircraft's own ground crews at other bases were not authorized to discuss. The Blackbird's true operational speed and altitude were never fully disclosed during its service life and remain only partially declassified today. It could outfly a missile fired directly at it by simply accelerating away, and its radar cross-section was reduced through early applications of the same radar-absorbent materials science that would later define stealth aircraft entirely, decades before the public had a name for the technology. But here is where the Blackbird's secrecy becomes a matter of eyewitness record, not speculation. Commercial pilots across the American Southwest filed hundreds of reports describing a fast-moving, dark, wedge-shaped object leaving no visible exhaust trail and outrunning any aircraft they could identify from their own cockpit reference materials. Air traffic control logs from the period, later reviewed by historians through Freedom of Information Act requests, confirm radar contacts the controllers themselves could not classify using any aircraft type listed in their own operating manuals at the time. Some of those same radar logs remained sealed for more than 30 years, filed alongside unrelated Cold War material, until historians combing through unrelated archive requests noticed the pattern and connected the anomalous tracks to the Blackbird's known flight corridors. Number 7. The D-21 Tagboard. Attached to a modified A-12 and later launched from a converted B-52, the D-21 was an unmanned, ramjet-powered reconnaissance drone developed at Groom Lake beginning in 1962. Intended to overfly denied airspace and photograph Chinese nuclear facilities without risking a pilot's life or a diplomatic incident. The drones flew at Mach 3.3 and released from its carrier aircraft mid-flight, a separation event that from the ground looked identical to an object detaching from another object in the open sky, 2 anomalies stacked into a single sighting where a witness expected only one aircraft to explain. The drone's cruising altitude put it above the range of nearly every civilian aircraft in service, and its ramjet engine produced a distinctive contrail pattern that ground observers described as splitting mid-flight, a detail that matched no known aircraft behavior available in any public reference at the time. But here is where the D-21 program becomes a story the Air Force itself tried to erase from its own records. The program was canceled in 1971 after a fatal launch accident killed a crew member during a test over the Pacific, and surviving drones were quietly buried in the Nevada desert rather than declassified, displayed, or even logged for historical preservation. They remained buried and largely unacknowledged until engineers rediscovered and exhumed them in the 1990s. What observers on the ground had reported for a decade had, in the Air Force's own internal paperwork, already stopped existing entirely. When the drones were finally exhumed decades later, several were found essentially intact, preserved by the dry desert soil, evidence of a program that had been deliberately concealed rather than simply forgotten. Number 6. Have Blue. In December 1977, a small, faceted, matte black aircraft unlike anything in the history of aviation lifted off from a runway at Groom Lake under a classified program named Have Blue. It was the technology demonstrator that would eventually produce the F-117 Nighthawk, the first operational stealth aircraft in any nation's arsenal. Have Blue's geometry was built entirely around radar deflection rather than aerodynamic elegance, producing a flying shape composed of dozens of flat, angular panels that the engineers who designed it privately called the Hopeless Diamond, because early wind tunnel data suggested it might not be able to fly at all. It looked, by design, like nothing that had ever flown in American skies before it, closer in silhouette to an origami sculpture than to any airplane taught in a flight training manual. But here is where Have Blue becomes personal for the people who actually saw it. Nevada residents living near the test range reported a silent, angular black shape crossing the night sky repeatedly through the late 1970s and early 1980s, reports that were publicly dismissed for years by officials as misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, or outright hoaxes. The Air Force did not officially confirm the existence of the F-117 program until November 1988, more than a decade after the first sightings had already begun circulating among residents who had no way to prove what they had seen. Some of those same residents later described a quiet vindication when the program was finally unveiled, not surprise at what the object had been, but confirmation that they had not imagined it. Number 5. Tacit Blue. Developed at Groom Lake in the early 1980s, Tacit Blue was a stealth technology demonstrator so unconventional in its appearance that the engineers who worked on it nicknamed it the Whale. Its curved, boxy fuselage was designed to test whether a stealth aircraft could maintain a low radar signature while flying straight and level on a surveillance track, rather than only while banking through evasive maneuvers. Tacit Blue flew nearly 135 test flights between 1982 and 1985, entirely within restricted airspace, its existence classified at a level above most other black programs of the decade, including some programs that were themselves already highly restricted, meaning several officials cleared to know about other black projects at Groom Lake were still not cleared to know Tacit Blue existed. But here is where Tacit Blue becomes evidence of exactly how long a fully operational program can stay buried from public knowledge. The aircraft's existence was not declassified until April 1996, 11 full years after its final flight, and the single surviving prototype was not placed on public display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force until that same year. For over a decade, an aircraft that had flown well over 100 missions in American airspace officially did not exist in any public government record. The aircraft's chief test pilot did not speak publicly about his own flights until after the 1996 declassification, meaning the person most qualified to explain the sightings had spent over a decade unable to say a single word about them. Number 4. Project Aquiline. Beginning in 1967, the CIA developed a small bird-like reconnaissance drone under a program named Aquiline, engineered to be mistaken at a glance for a large bird of prey, specifically a hawk, while carrying miniaturized surveillance equipment over sensitive foreign terrain. The drone measured roughly 4 feet in length and was built to mimic natural gliding and flapping flight patterns closely enough to avoid detection by both human ground observers and radar operators who had been specifically trained to distinguish aircraft from wildlife on their scopes, a distinction the program was engineered from its first sketches to defeat. But here is where Aquiline becomes a program that quietly rewired what a UFO report could even mean, decades before drones were part of public vocabulary. Declassified CIA program summaries confirm that Aquiline was flight tested at multiple sites, including areas near Groom Lake, before the program was ultimately canceled in 1971 due to persistent cost overruns and mechanical reliability problems. For years afterward, isolated reports of anomalous, silent, bird-like objects performing precise surveillance pattern flight paths circulated through local newspapers and ranger stations, with no public program available to explain a single one of them. Declassified budget records show the program consumed several $1 million across 4 years of development, funds that at the time appeared on no public ledger connected to any known aviation contractor. Number 3. Bird of Prey. Developed in secret by Boeing's Phantom Works division beginning in 1992 and tested extensively in restricted Nevada airspace near Groom Lake, Bird of Prey was a stealth technology demonstrator built to trial radar-absorbing materials, low observable shaping techniques, and rapid prototyping manufacturing methods years ahead of their eventual public introduction into fielded aircraft. The aircraft's unofficial name came from its physical resemblance to a fictional spacecraft from a well-known science fiction franchise, a joke among the engineers who built it that survived all the way into the program's own internal documentation. It flew nearly 40 test flights entirely unacknowledged by any public agency, taking off and landing at a private Nevada airstrip built specifically to keep the program's ground crew separate from any personnel working on government-run projects nearby. But here is where Bird of Prey becomes a lesson in exactly how long a privately funded black project can survive without a single public leak reaching a journalist or a congressional committee. The program remained fully classified for 8 consecutive years. Boeing did not declassify or publicly reveal the aircraft's existence until October 2002, wheeling the prototype into a museum with almost no advance announcement, presenting it to a public that had never once suspected the program existed at all, let alone that it had already flown for the better part of a decade. Boeing has since credited the program with techniques that shaped later stealth designs, meaning a project no outside observer ever confirmed seeing had already, by the time of its unveiling, quietly changed the shape of American aircraft still flying today. Number 2. The YF-12. Derived from the same airframe family as the A-12, the YF-12 was tested at Groom Lake beginning in 1963 as an experimental long-range interceptor armed with air-to-air missiles and capable of sustained flight above Mach 3, performance that no publicly acknowledged interceptor of the era came remotely close to matching in official specifications, according to figures that would not be fully released until long after the aircraft itself had left service. The Air Force partially acknowledged the YF-12's existence in a limited 1964 press announcement, but its true performance figures, weapons capability, and complete test history remained classified for years afterward, creating a persistent and measurable gap between what the public had officially been told and what the aircraft had actually demonstrated in restricted Nevada airspace. But here is where the YF-12 becomes proof that partial disclosure can generate just as much confusion as total secrecy, if not more. Pilots and residents across the Southwest continued reporting extreme high-speed intercepts and unexplained radar contacts that did not match the aircraft's publicly released specifications for more than a decade after its limited unveiling to the press. The government, in this case, had technically told the truth, it had simply not told all of it, and the gap between the two versions became its own source of speculation. Full performance data on the YF-12's weapons systems and true operational ceiling would not be released until decades later, long after the aircraft itself had been retired and placed in museums where visitors could stand beside it without knowing what it had actually been capable of. Number 1. The admission. For nearly 60 years, the United States government would not confirm in any public document bearing an official signature that the facility at Groom Lake existed under the name most Americans already used for it in casual conversation. Every single aircraft on this list had been designed, tested, or flown there. None of the government's own paperwork said so, even as Congress quietly funded the base's operations year after year under budget lines that never used its name. That changed in August 2013 when the National Security Archive at George Washington University obtained a declassified CIA internal history of the U-2 program through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit filed years earlier. a document that used the words Area 51 in an official United States government record for the first time in the base's operational history. But here is where the admission becomes the largest piece of the pattern, not the end of it. The 2013 document confirmed the base's central role in testing the U-2, OXCART, and a handful of other named programs, but large sections of the released history remained redacted in full, and no comprehensive public list of everything tested at the facility has ever been released by any agency. 6 decades of aircraft, one partial admission, decades after most of the programs it describes had already been retired. An unknown number of programs, by the government's own admission, remain classified to this day. Every sighting on this list had a name, a date, and a file number somewhere in a government archive long before it had an explanation the public was allowed to read. And every explanation on this list arrived only after the aircraft that caused it had already been retired. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.